The Horowitz Legacy, a retrospective look. Wait do you see this? This is amazing.
Thank you, James. That you've given me a lot to live up to, so I'll try. Can everyone hear me in the back? Because I'm going to be more or less centered here, and the mic is kind of over here. But if you can hear me, that's good. So I'd like to say good morning. This is a big anniversary weekend in a number of ways, and James touched on some of that last night and this morning. It is our 80th, and it's also the founder, David Horowitz. Had he lived, he would be 120 years old this month, and he would have matched Moses, the great lawgiver. Later this month, the state of Israel will begin celebrating their 75th year of statehood. And as James mentioned, it was 30 years ago when he and I first met in New York. We met at the B'nai Zion Friendship Center in Manhattan. We gathered there on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of UIWU and the 90th birthday of our founder, David Horowitz. So I'd just like to read a prepared statement in beginning. In 1947, Abba Eban became Israel's first official ambassador to the United Nations. But he was not the first Jewish voice at that world body. That distinction belongs to David Horowitz, who became the first Jewish journalist to obtain official press accreditation after the founding of the UN, and he left an unparalleled legacy at the world body that he often called the Parliament of Man. That was his favorite term for the UN. Horowitz's brilliant career at the UN was not his only significant accomplishment. At the time of his joining the UN Press Corps in the mid-1940s, he also founded an organization he named United Israel World Union, whose mission it was to become a global movement to promote the universal values of the Decalogue faith, the vision of the Hebrew prophets, and the role that he felt a united Israel had yet to play on the world stage. This weekend, we celebrate the 80th year in the history of that movement. I'm going to do a quick review. You saw 2 or 3 of these slides last night that David showed, but I'm going to try to give a little background on it and maybe a few unknown facts about it. David was an early pioneer back in the 1920s, and if I can frame it for you, in 1924, he boarded an old steamship called the USS Madonna. It anchored off the port. Actually, it was no port. He anchored off the waters in Joppa. And that was a time when there was no ports. And just think about this now. Everything on the boat, passengers, luggage, had to be rowed ashore. This was 1924. David was on that boat as a young 21-year-old pioneer going to British-held Palestine. He spent several years on a couple of different kibbutz. He immersed himself in the study of the Hebrew language. He explored the country. He went into the Negev, into the wilderness of Judea, as it was called, the Arava, south. They had no modern highways like we have today. The modes of transportation was hiking or horseback. He rode horseback into the desert. He climbed Masada. He took the snake path up. You know, Josephus spoke of 2 different ways to reach the top of Masada. David was present at the founding, official opening of Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. If many of you who've been to Israel, you can't miss it. It's high on a hill there. He was there in April of 1925 when they dedicated the first university. he witnessed, and you'll remember these names from history, he witnessed Lord Balfour, who signed the Balfour Declaration that the Jews should be given a homeland or given a home in their ancient homeland. Lord Balfour was there and spoke. Also present was Field Marshal Sir Edmund Allenby, who in 1917 had liberated Jerusalem. So he actually saw them speak in 1925. And by the way, I've said this before, but some may not have heard it. If you happen to have sat on Hebrew University's board of governors, you would have shared a position with the likes of Martin Buber, Chaim Weizmann, Albert Einstein, and Sigmund Freud. I've sat on a few boards of corporations. I've thought, what in the world would I have had to contribute if I hadn't been a member of that board, except maybe to perhaps ask for a few autographs. A little known story, later in 1952, Chaim Weizmann, who sat on that board, became Israel's first president. He died while he was in office. And David Ben-Gurion offered the position of president to Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein turned down the presidency and said he was deeply moved by the offer, but he did not feel he was suited for the job. By the way, David is shown in this picture. He's dead center holding up the canine mascot. If you can see him there in the middle. He's got a big wide grin. That was it. You could always tell David by his grin. And that's, it's a great old photo. Okay, we'll give a brief review and an overview, a little more in depth. But David was well connected. He was an associate friend and a confidant of many leading ambassadors, representatives, and statesmen at the UN, literally a who's who of the UN. But here are a few. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister. David Ben-Gurion and David Horowitz was very close to Ben-Gurion. We have correspondence. We have personal letters they exchanged. We have those in the archive. James spoke of those old yellowed. Okay, we don't touch them anymore. We made copies and we put them in the paper there. But David Ben-Gurion led the struggle for Israel to become a state and then became the first prime minister. He was small in stature. He stood about 5'5", but he was a giant in the history of Israel. Some referred to him as the most influential person in Israel's history since Moses. They often communicated regarding the pressing issues of the young state. After all, Horowitz was the Jewish voice of the press at the United Nations. And as I mentioned, we have a number of original copies, and they were close, and they had a deep friendship. Benjamin Netanyahu, the man David called Bibi. Well, he's much in the news these days, and we absolutely won't go there. But Bibi became the State of Israel's new ambassador to the UN in 1984. They became friends. Bibi would often drop by David's little UN office, both being Jewish, and would light candles on occasions such as Hanukkah. And I think we have a picture somewhere in the archives of them lighting candles together. Later in 1996, Bibi became the youngest person ever elected prime minister in Israel. And of course now he's the longest serving prime minister to have ever served. The next year in 1997, during a commercial trip to Israel, I had the opportunity to meet with Bibi Netanyahu along with a few other businessmen. We were over on business. And I hand-delivered a personal letter from David Horowitz to Bibi. And he looked through it, and this big smile on his face, and he said, "You tell him that I will answer him personally." Abba Eban. He's another Israeli ambassador to the UN, and he was a permanent representative of the UN during the decades of the 1950s. He was probably the most gifted orator to ever represent Israel at the United Nations, and at a time of great stress for the company. I've read many of his talks to the UN where he would make powerful appeals for the state of Israel and the people of Israel. And believe me, it was brilliant. I always thought that Avi Eban would have been a great prime minister. Yosef Tekoa. David was a close friend of Ambassador Yosef Tekoa when he served at his post as legal advisor, ambassador, and permanent representative to the United Nations. They continued their friendship long after Tekoa left the U.S., returned to Israel, and he later became president of Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and later served as its chancellor. Yosef Tekoa and David remain lifelong friends. Horowitz had a number of indirect connections to that university. First of all, he was very close to Ben Gurion, for whom the university was named. Of course, Tekoa, who was one of the first presidents, and David were close. And David was also very close to a man by the name of Rudy Boyko, who lived in Manhattan and oddly enough had a little summer home in New Jersey. David lived in Manhattan, had a little summer cottage in New Jersey. Rudy Boyko owned a steel mill. And quite frankly, he put up an awful lot of money, made arrangements for the land, and put up an awful lot of money to fund the beginning of Ben Gurion University. And now, today, there is a research center named the Boyko Research Center. There's a huge statue there, and it's kind of reminds me of modern art in a way. But Boyko asked David Horowitz, would he suggest a name for the statue? It was made in the U.S. and shipped over, taken apart, shipped over on a boat. It's now in front of the Boyko Research Center, and it's called Kava, the mother of all living. And David had given it that name at Rudy Boyko's request. Dag Hammarskjöld, a giant. Dag Hammarskjöld was the greatest Secretary General the UN has ever known. He once famously stated that the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. Horowitz and Hammarskjöld had a special working relationship. They were both born in Sweden, both Swedes. Mutual respect. They had great chemistry and a great working relationship. And that, of course, lasted until Hammarskjöld's tragic death in 1961 in a plane crash. It's really a tale of two Swedes, and they both left an incredible legacy. Finally, Golda Meir. On March 17, 1969, 71-year-old Golda Meir was elected the fourth Prime Minister of Israel. She became Israel's first and only woman to hold the office of Prime Minister. She served as Prime Minister during a very difficult period during the Munich Olympics massacre in 1972 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. It was during this period that she met David Horowitz for the first time. David's role and some of his accomplishments are highlighted here. He was instrumental in the behind-the-scenes efforts resulting in the establishment and the recognition of the State of Israel. And he helped to influence a sitting president behind the scenes, and it had to do with influence a Latin American group who was convinced to vote as a bloc, and finally gave enough votes for Israel to be recognized as a state. And it took President Truman, who was in office, it took him 11 minutes after Israel declared themselves a nation among the nations to sign to formally recognize Israel's independence. And he did it over the objection of his State Department, the Pentagon, and the CIA, all of which opposed the founding of the Jewish state. David was president of the Foreign Press Association. He was voted in by the members in 1966. He was president of the United Nations Correspondents Association in 1981. And by the way, that was an organization that he was instrumental in helping to form when there were just very few representatives. And they all had their own agenda. They reported for newspapers and periodicals going back home. There was the tensions, there was the political. And David felt if they could be brought together as a group and occasionally get together over some refreshments or dinner or something, they would form a bond because they were kind of in that same boat together. So today there are over 250 members of the UN Correspondents Association. David was the author of 2 books on early Zionism. His first, 33 Candles, that was an autobiography published in 1949. He also published Pastor Charles Taz Russell, an early American Christian Zionist. He published in 1990. And when Netanyahu that was during a time Netanyahu was Israel's ambassador to the UN. And Bibi wrote a nice endorsement, rather lengthy endorsement, that appears on the back cover of David's book on Charles Taz Russell. And David is always very proud of that, and very proud of Bibi when he became prime minister. David won a number of awards, and these were very distinguished awards. He won the Defender of Israel Medal in 1977 by Prime Minister Menachem Begin. He was given that award for distinguished service to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people. Also, the Defender of Jerusalem Award in 1991 by Yitzhak Shamir, and that was given in recognition of a lifelong dedication to the well-being of the people of Israel and a steadfast commitment to Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people. He received the Mordecai Ben David Award in 1982 from Yeshiva University for his humanitarian service. He was a fellow at the Jewish Academy of Arts and Sciences, accepted in 1982. David also won the Zachor Award, which was a quite prestigious award. David was active in bringing Nazi war criminals to justice, many hiding in the United States. 2 of the key figures, Valerin Treifa and Frederick Kohr, both were hiding here. One had become a Catholic priest. David helped to expose not only those war criminals, but combat all forms of anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist propaganda. And he was awarded that prestigious Zachor Award in 1981 for those efforts. Now, these are great old photos. Many of them are official UN photos. We inherited those when we cleaned out his UN office and his apartment. And these are in the archives here in Charlotte. And I just wanted to be sure that everyone had a chance to see a few of these, what we call portraits of the past. The first you see here is Ambassador Abba Eban, of whom I spoke, is seen greeting his old friend in a common cause after a UN session. Later in 1952, Abba Eban was elected vice president of the UN Nations General Assembly. But he knew David well, and this is David on the left greeting Abba Eban. Young journalist David Horowitz and his wife Nan are seen here greeting a young Menachem Begin during an early 1950s visit to New York for a speaking engagement. Nan Riley, who was David's wife, second wife, he had lost his first wife and his son tragically in Poland. He lost his son at Auschwitz. And he and Nan were married in New York, and Nan Riley met Menachem Begin long before David did. She was an Irish immigrant. She worked for the pro-Ergon American Committee for a Free Israel that helped to raise funds for the Jewish underground movement when they were battling the British on the fronts there. And that's where she met a young Ergon leader by the name of Menachem Begin. So what you see here is Begin visiting New York and Nan and David greeting him. Anybody recognize the man on the right? Are you old enough to know who he is? Journalist David Horowitz had interviewed and written about countless world leaders. Here he greets Nikita Khrushchev. If you were old enough to remember, you'll also remember the very serious Cuban Missile Crisis that really put the world on the brink of a nuclear war. Here, David greets Khrushchev at the UN just before he entered the General Assembly in 1950. This is a program for the 50. This was the famous shoe banging incident that took place. Anybody remember that? He was notorious, Khrushchev, for his eccentric outburst. And just before when he went into the meeting, he had one of those. He pulled off his right shoe and he banged it on the desk at arguably one of the most stormy sessions that the UN has ever seen. This is a picture just before that happened. This is an old photo of Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who David was so close to. Is shown here presenting the coveted Defender of Israel Award and Medal to journalist David Horowitz in 1977. It's one of the awards I spoke about in the previous slide. He did so in recognition of his distinguished service to the State of Israel and the Jewish people. Here is a photo of Prime Minister Golda Meir, and it looks as she's being offered a few words of wise counsel by an old UN journalist. UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, if you remember that name, is shown here at a press briefing at the UN. Seated to the right of the vacant chair in the center, just behind it, is journalist David Horowitz, reporting for the World Union Press. You'll see him just behind the only chair that's vacant there. Waldheim served as the fourth Secretary General at the UN from 1972 to 1981, so it would have been within that time frame. He later served as President of Austria from 1986 to 1992 in a later life. You may if you're an old timer like me, you may recognize the person in this picture. He's actor Kirk Douglas. He's seen here being interviewed by a young journalist, David Horowitz, in 1949. That was the year that Douglas starred in the movie Champion, for which he was nominated for the Academy Award for the Best Actor. And this is David there interviewing a young Kirk Douglas. It's a picture of David that I wanted to include with not a lot of comment. He's seated at the UN General Assembly, and with the open chairs, it looks like he was early and probably getting ready for it to start. You get his thoughts together. All right, if you've ever been in or saw a picture of David's office, this is what it looked like. He's shown here in his UN press section office on the third floor of the Secretariat building at the United Nations. It seems like an entire history of the UN could be found in David's office if you'll look behind. All of those are old photos just pinned on the wall in various disarray. It's photos of David with dignitaries from all over the world, depicting his long participation in the history of the United Nations. And it looks like he's busy compiling another syndicated column before a press deadline. And that photo was taken around 1970. The last slide I wanted to share with you, and I had to dig it out of my files, and James was gracious enough to, James, and I want to give him a lot of credit, he put this presentation together for me because I'm an absolute dinosaur. I'm old, and United Israel is 80 years old, and that's old, and I know that because it's almost as old as me. And so James graciously agreed to take my draft and prep and put it in a nice package, and you see here. So he added this later because I found it later. But it's a note from Benjamin Netanyahu when he was prime minister. And I had met him in 90, delivered the letter. He had answered David. All right, this is for his 95th birthday. And he had written David, or sent him this card, Mazel Tov to David Horowitz, on his 95th birthday. And you can see the envelope there for it. And you see the little note David scratched on it at the top. When he got that, he was so happy. That's a little note to Becky and me. And he wrote it up there, and he sent us a copy immediately. He just had to let us know that he'd heard from Bibi. So we've kept that in the files, and it was a message from the current prime minister. And when I think about it, David was good friends with the very first prime minister of Israel, and to date, the very last prime minister of Israel. Not last as in the last. Hopefully there'll be more. But the one that was then and the one that's now. Okay. James mentioned the autobiography that I wrote of David, published in 2018, and I just, since he mentioned it, I didn't want to put this in here without him mentioning it, because I said, look, it's going to look like a commercial. It's going to look like self-serving. I'm pitching my book. I'm not doing that. But I do have a few comments about it. I'll leave the pitching to someone else. I was privileged to have written a biography that I did publish in 2018 that I named The Book of David, David Horowitz, Dean of United Nations Press Corps and founder of United Israel World Union. Copies are in the back. It's really both the Horowitz Legacy and a documented history of United Israel World Union. It was compiled from thousands, and literally thousands, of United Israel bulletins, records, UN documents. And the book chronicles the second half of David's life. He had written 33 Candles, and that had chronicled the first half. That ended about mid-40s, 44, 45. I picked this up then, so it became a sequel, if you will. The book chronicles his second half, beginning in 1944, and covers his journalistic career at the UN, his profound influence in the founding and defense of the State of Israel, and the founding of our organization. And the book also provides the only completely documented story of the history of United Israel, because I captured every meeting from 44 up until the time I published the book. I covered the meeting, I mentioned where it was, the date, keynote speakers, and so forth. So I did want to chronicle that so we would have a record. So having said that, I want to mention some other voices that, you know, we talk a lot about David here because you know how we feel. He's our founder, and we talk about his legacy. But there were those who were kind enough to endorse or provide a written endorsement for my book, and I included these on the back cover. And I just wanted to share with you what others had to say. David's legacy is best described by some of these distinguished voices. And I won't read through all this. I'll hit a few key points. The first is this biography of Zionist pioneer David Horowitz, veteran United Nations correspondent, friend of Israel prime ministers and presidents for over 50 years, Nazi hunter and friend of Israel, is long overdue. Now, later on it says Horowitz also played a historic role in the 1947 vote for the partition of British Mandate Palestine. In this way, he was instrumental in behind the scenes in the creation of the modern state of Israel. That testimony was written by Simcha Jacobovici. Some of you met him. Many of you probably have heard of him. He's an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. He's adjunct professor at Huntington University in Ontario, and he was kind enough to endorse the book, and I have included it on the book. The next states, from his writings to his work at the United Nations through to his establishment of the United Israel World Union, David Horowitz was present and active at critical junctures in Israel's relations with the international community throughout the 20th century. As such, he's been inscribed in the annals of our people Israel. That was written by Ilan Pomeranz. Many of you... Sorry, thank you, James. I wasn't paying attention to that. Yeah, okay, thank you. He's our friend in Israel. He also is a member of our advisory council for United Israel World Union. Called Israel's Watchman on the Wall by his peers at the United Nations, David Horowitz is well deserving of his place among the heroes of his people and his journalistic profession. Paul Weinberg, president of Alden Films, contributed that. One sentence. David Horowitz was the institutional memory. Sorry. I'm not following my slides here, so forgive me. Maybe we can edit that out. Okay. David Horowitz was the institutional memory of the United Nations, written by CNS News UN Bureau, Chargé Bureau. I met him after David died, and we cleaned his office. I went back and made an appointment with Sergei, and I sat in his office, and we talked about David for, gosh, at least 40, 45 minutes. And he gave me a copy of a tremendous testimonial that he was writing to all the journalists, and he wanted it published. And he had just put it out. And I remember him giving me a copy of that before I left the UN. But he loved David, and he knew David's impact at the UN. Okay, the Book of David is a penetrating and moving portrait of an emblematic 20th century figure, pioneer Zionist and citizen of the world, bridge builder between nations and religions, fighter for justice, foreign correspondent, and journalistic mentor, and intimate of the great and powerful from Enrico Caruso to Benjamin Netanyahu. You kind of want to put a cape on David's back after reading that. But that was written by Vanni Capelli, and who's president of the Afghanistan Foreign Press Association. Vanni's the son of John Capelli, who shared an office with David at the UN, room 373, for over 40 years. They were roommates, if you will, at the press. And Vanni grew up around David and said David was the only grandfather I ever knew. And so he has a special place in his heart for David, and he was kind enough to make this contribution. Mr. Horowitz knows the UN inside out, keeping an eye on everything that goes on there. He knows everyone. More than that, there's no one like him as an expert in understanding all the UN elements. He keeps a watchful eye on the maneuverings of the delegations that aim their venom at Israel. Thus, Horowitz fulfills a vital task as both a watchman and a champion of Israel. That's not included in my book because I didn't find it until long after the book was printed. But I wanted to add it to this collection because it was written by Dr. Hillel Seidman, who was a journalist and author of the Warsaw Ghetto Diary. And it was an article published in one of the newspapers in 1984. Now, I realized I've given you an absolute fire hose of information, and there's just so much more that we could spend time on. And that's why basically that I wrote the Horowitz biography, is to capture that legacy of a man whose contribution to the Jewish cause deserved to be documented and preserved for posterity. United Nations at 80. And James spoke about these two things this morning, and I wanted to add a couple of comments. I want to share a few thoughts about the organization that Horowitz founded. He wrote these words, and I know you heard them this morning, but he wrote the following words in his original notes when he founded the organization. You see them here at the bottom. And I'll repeat them again. To study, to learn, to practice, and teach original biblical truths in all its simplicity, without pomp, fanfare, tyranny, hypocrisy, or fanaticism. I've always felt that's good advice. Because what UN is not, it's not a church, it's not a synagogue, it's not a medrasha, it's not a mosque. It functions as a non-political, non-sectarian, non-profit educational organization dedicated to propagating the ideals of the Decalogue faith on a universal scale. That's what you see here at the bottom. It's an organization with a unique beginning and a unique message. The words of the prophets aren't just written on the subway walls. They're written on a big wall at the UN. The wall is at the UN compound, and here you see journalist David Horowitz standing in front of that wall, and it's a famous quote by Isaiah. The words are chiseled in granite from the book of Isaiah, and it was etched into the granite in 1950, around 1950. And that was about the same time that the entire UN complex was being built. Journalist David Horowitz saw both the building of the wall, and he saw the building of the UN. He said, "Ralph, I watched it go up brick by brick." It was built over an old garbage dump on the banks of Turtle Bay. Everyone knows where the UN is today. And when we say that David was there at its inception, he truly was. He watched it go up, and then he became the first accredited journalist. I'd like to begin to close. I want to come back to that. There we go. I'd like to begin to close with this statement. 8 decades ago, United Israel World Union and the United Nations both emerged from a dark and frightening period of history. The foundational precepts of international peace and security, justice, human rights, responsible social and economic development, and responsible stewardship of our planet and its environment stand as core principles of both organizations. They're reflected in the preamble and charter of the UN, and they're also integral to United Israel as basic tenets drawn directly from the pages of the Torah and the prophets. David Horowitz founded one organization and was a charter member of the other, and he spent over a half-century promoting the higher purpose of both organizations. Today, we celebrate UIW turning 80 years old. David always said that the great lawgiver Moses did his best work after turning 80. So perhaps United Israel World Union is destined to achieve its greatest work after it turns 80. Thank you.